He said there wasn't space for me. What he discovered next shocked the entire family. The morning mist clung to the lake like a gentle embrace, and Sandra Collins stood at the front door of what everyone called the family lake house. Her fingers wrapped around a set of brand new keys. The metal was still warm from her palm, and as she slid the key into the lock, she heard the solid, satisfying click that meant everything had changed. Behind her, a car door slammed with the sharp finality of shattered expectations. Philip Thornfield stood frozen beside his silver SUV, his mouth slightly open, while his wife Jennifer clutched her designer bag like a shield. Their combined children clustered around them, confusion painting their young faces as they stared at the woman they'd dismissed as irrelevant just 24 hours ago. Sandra? Philip's voice cracked on her name, and she could hear 25 years of assumptions crumbling in that single word. What are you doing here? She turned slowly, and for the first time in years, Sandra felt the morning sun on her face without the urge to apologize for taking up space. Her silver-streaked brown hair caught the light, and she wore the same simple but quality clothes that had always hinted at something more substantial than anyone bothered to notice. But today, everything about her posture spoke of quiet, unshakable certainty. "I'm coming home, Philip," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed. "To my house." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Jennifer's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the shock that drained color from her cheeks. The children shifted uncomfortably, suddenly understanding that the weekend they'd planned, the exclusive family bonding they'd looked forward to, had just collided with a reality none of them had seen coming. 6 months ago, Sandra would have apologized for being there. She would have stammered some explanation, maybe offered to leave, certainly would have prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own rightful place. But standing there with the key to her own property in her hand, feeling the wooden deck she'd helped choose beneath her feet, listening to the birds sing in the trees that grew on land she owned, Sandra felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. She felt at home in her own life. "I don't understand," Sarah's voice drifted from the cluster of confused faces. At 28, Sandra's daughter had her father's sharp features and her mother's thoughtful eyes, though right now those eyes were wide with bewilderment. Dad said, "I thought the lake house was what, sweetheart?" Sandra asked gently, and there was no anger in her voice, only the patient tone of someone who was finally ready to speak the truth. "What exactly did your father tell you about this place?" Philip stepped forward, his jaw tight with the kind of authority he'd grown used to wielding unopposed. "Sandra, this is ridiculous. We had an agreement about what?" The interruption came so quietly, it was almost lost in the morning breeze, but something in Sandra's tone made everyone freeze. "Philip, I'm genuinely curious. What agreement did we have about my property?" The word hung in the air like morning fog, heavy and impossible to ignore. My property, not the family property, not our old place, not even the lake house. My property. And in that moment, watching Philip's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickering recognition of a truth he'd somehow never grasped, Sandra realized just how far she'd traveled from the woman who used to disappear herself to keep everyone else comfortable. This is the story of that journey. How a quiet woman who owned everything learned to stop pretending she owned nothing, and how sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with simply refusing to hand over the keys to your own life. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Weathered Rose Stories family. Your place in this circle of powerful, heartfelt journeys is waiting for you. These stories of women rising, healing, and reclaiming their strength have inspired thousands to find their own courage. Make sure you hit the bell, too, so you'll know the moment a new chapter of resilience and triumph is shared here with you. But to understand how Sandra Collins came to stand so confidently at her own front door, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the woman she was just 6 months earlier, when the phone call that would change everything first rang through her quiet kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Sandra had always been the kind of woman who moved through the world like water, finding the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them, shaping herself to fit whatever container life provided. At 58, she lived in a modest but impeccably maintained colonial in Millbrook, Massachusetts, a house that whispered rather than shouted its quality. The kind of place where every detail had been carefully chosen and lovingly maintained, from the hand-planted herb garden by the kitchen window to the built-in bookshelves that held decades of carefully curated literature. To anyone looking from the outside, Sandra Collins appeared to be exactly what Philip had always said she was, a divorced woman managing gracefully on her settlement, keeping busy with part-time work at the local library and volunteer shifts at the community center. She drove a well-maintained Honda that she'd bought used, though she never mentioned it was barely 6 months old when she'd purchased it, or that she'd paid cash. Her clothes came from department stores rather than boutiques, classic pieces in navy and gray and cream that would last for years and never draw attention to themselves. She was, in every visible way, unremarkable, which was exactly how she'd learned to like it. The kitchen, where Sandra spent most of her evenings, was her sanctuary, a space that perfectly captured her approach to life. The appliances were high quality but understated, chosen for function rather than flash. The granite countertops were a subtle pattern in soft grays and whites, and the custom cabinets had been painted the exact shade of sage green that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. Everything about the room suggested comfort and capability, the domain of someone who understood that true luxury was often invisible to casual observers. It was there, while she was preparing her famous 3-cheese lasagna for Sarah's 28th birthday dinner, that the phone rang with the call that would finally force Sandra to examine the life she'd so carefully constructed. Sandra? Philip's voice carried that particular tone of casual authority that had once made her automatically defer to whatever he was about to say. After 3 years of divorce, she still felt her shoulders tense slightly when she heard it. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. The dismissive assumption in that phrase, that whatever Sandra might be doing couldn't possibly be as important as whatever Philip wanted to discuss, was so familiar she almost didn't notice it. Almost. "I'm cooking for Sarah's birthday," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel embroidered with tiny lavender flowers. "What did you need?" "Right, Sarah's birthday." "Good." There was the sound of papers shuffling, the click of what she recognized as his expensive pen tapping against his desk. Philip Thornfield, 60 years old and still convinced that the world operated according to his preferences, was clearly multitasking. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about the lake house trip next month." Sandra's hand stilled on the dish towel. The annual lake house trip had been a family tradition since Sarah was 13 and James was 15. Every Memorial Day weekend, they would pack up the cars with coolers full of Sandra's homemade food, bags of games and books and fishing equipment, and drive the 3 hours to the crystal-clear lake in New Hampshire, where they would spend 4 days reconnecting as a family. Even after the divorce, even after Philip's remarriage to Jennifer, they'd maintained the tradition. It was, Sandra had thought, one of the few things that remained sacred in their fractured family dynamic. "What about it?" she asked, though something in Philip's tone had already begun to curl uneasily in her stomach. "Well, we're going to have to make some adjustments this year." Philip's voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone delivering information rather than having a conversation. "Jennifer's kids are going to join us, both Tyler and Madison, And frankly, there just isn't space for everyone." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Sandra found herself gripping the dish towel harder than necessary. "What do you mean there isn't space?" "Come on, Sandra. You know how small the place is. 5 bedrooms, sure. But with Jennifer and me, Sarah and her boyfriend, James, and now Jennifer's 2 kids, it's just too cramped. Someone has to sit this one out, and since you're the only one without anyone—" Philip's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Since you're alone, since you're the extra person, since you don't really belong anymore. "So we thought," Philip continued, his tone growing more confident as he interpreted Sandra's silence as acceptance, "that you might actually enjoy having a quiet weekend at home. You're always talking about wanting more time to work in your garden." Sandra stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something quieter, but more dangerous. It was the first crack in a foundation she'd spent years carefully constructing, the first whisper of a question she'd been avoiding for far too long. When exactly had she become disposable? "Sandra, you there?" Philip's voice carried a note of impatience now. He had other calls to make, other decisions to implement. Her feelings about this weren't really part of the equation. "I'm here," she said softly. "Great. So we're all set then? I'll let the kids know about the new arrangements. Philip." The word came out more sharply than she'd intended, and she could hear his surprise in the brief silence that followed. "Yeah?" Sandra looked around her kitchen in her house, surrounded by the life she'd built for herself, and felt the question forming before she could stop it. "Who's paying for this trip?" Another pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I asked. Who's covering the expenses for the lake house weekend?" "Sandra, what kind of question is that? It's a family expense. We all contribute." "Do we?" The words came out steadier than she felt. "Because I can't remember the last time anyone asked me to contribute to anything. I just handle things." "Look, I don't know what you're getting at here, but—" "I'm not getting at anything," Sandra interrupted, and the unfamiliar sound of her own voice cutting through Philip surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I'm asking a simple question. If I'm not invited to the family lake house trip, who exactly is paying for the family lake house?" The silence that followed stretched so long that Sandra wondered if the call had been dropped. When Philip finally spoke, his voice carried a new edge, the tone of someone whose authority had been questioned in a way he wasn't used to handling. "Sandra, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. It's just one weekend. Everyone understands that sometimes adjustments have to be made for the good of the family. For the good of the family." The phrase hit Sandra like cold water, washing away the last of her automatic deference. For 25 years of marriage and 3 years of divorce, she'd heard that phrase, used to justify every decision that prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own. Philip's career move that uprooted her from the teaching job she loved, the social obligations that drained their savings account, the renovation projects that reflected his taste rather than hers, even the divorce itself, which Philip had presented as something that would ultimately be better for everyone. And now her exclusion from a family tradition was being packaged in the same careful language. For the good of the family, Sandra Collins needed to disappear. "I see," she said quietly. "I knew you'd understand." Relief flooded Philip's voice. "You've always been reasonable about these things, Sandra. It's one of your best qualities, one of her best qualities, her reasonableness, her willingness to step aside, to make room, to prioritize everyone else's needs without complaint. For 28 years, Sandra had been praised for being understanding, for being flexible, for being the one who could always be counted on to sacrifice her own wants for the sake of family harmony. Standing in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and the smell of her daughter's birthday lasagna filling the air, Sandra realized with sudden crystal clarity that she had been praised for disappearing herself. And she had been so good at it, so consistent in her self-erasure, that her own family had forgotten she was supposed to matter too. "Thank you for letting me know," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, steady and calm and completely empty of the warm accommodation everyone expected from her. "Great. I'll talk to you later then." The line went dead, and Sandra stood holding the phone for a long moment before slowly placing it back in its cradle. The kitchen around her looked exactly the same. The sage green cabinets, the granite countertops, the carefully chosen details that reflected a life of quiet taste and modest means. But something fundamental had shifted, like the moment when you realize you've been looking at an optical illusion and suddenly see the completely different image that was there all along. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at her garden, where the early spring flowers were just beginning to push through the soil. Daffodils and crocuses, tulips and hyacinths, all planted with her own hands in soil she'd prepared and tended. Beautiful things that would bloom whether anyone noticed them or not, strong and vibrant and completely independent of anyone's approval. For the first time in years, Sandra wondered what her own life might look like if she stopped seeking permission to live it. Chapter 2. The birthday dinner that evening should have been a celebration, but Sandra found herself watching her family with new eyes as they gathered around her dining room table. Sarah arrived with her boyfriend Marcus, a kind-hearted architect who always complimented Sandra's cooking with genuine enthusiasm. James came straight from his teaching job at the local high school, still wearing the patient expression that made him beloved by teenagers and exhausted by family drama. As they shared the 3-cheese lasagna Sandra had spent the afternoon perfecting, she listened to their conversation with a strange sense of detachment. Sarah was excitedly describing the marketing campaign she was developing for a luxury hotel chain. James was telling a funny story about his AP history students' creative interpretations of the Revolutionary War. Marcus was asking thoughtful questions about Sandra's garden, the only person at the table who seemed genuinely interested in her life. It wasn't until dessert, Sandra's signature lemon cake with cream cheese frosting, that the subject of the lake house trip came up. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said, licking frosting from her fork with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who'd grown up knowing she was loved. "Dad mentioned the lake house plans have changed a little this year." Sandra's hand stilled as she was cutting another slice of cake for James. "Did he?" "Yeah, Jennifer's kids are finally old enough to really enjoy it, so it'll be more of a blended family bonding thing." Sarah's voice carried the careful cheerfulness of someone delivering news she suspected might be unwelcome. "You understand, right? You know how Dad wants to build something solid with Jennifer's family." There it was again. "You understand," the automatic assumption that Sandra's understanding, her willingness to step aside, to make room, to prioritize everyone else's needs, was simply a given. Not a choice she made, not a sacrifice she offered, but simply the natural order of things. "And honestly," James added, reaching for his coffee cup, "you could probably use the break anyway. You do so much for these family things. Maybe it would be nice to have a quiet weekend at home." Marcus glanced between the siblings and their mother, and Sandra could see the moment when he registered the undercurrents in the conversation. His dark eyebrows drew together slightly, but he stayed silent, waiting to see how Sandra would respond. "A break," Sandra repeated slowly. "Exactly." Sarah's relief was audible. "You're always organizing everything, cooking everything, making sure everyone has what they need. When was the last time you just relaxed?" Sandra looked at her daughter, beautiful, accomplished Sarah, who had inherited her father's confidence and her mother's thoughtfulness, but somehow missed the lesson about considering other people's feelings. At 28, Sarah lived in a world where problems could be solved with enough planning and good intentions, where difficult conversations could be smoothed over with the right words and sufficient enthusiasm. "Sarah," Sandra said quietly, "do you know who pays for the lake house trips?" Sarah blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "What do you mean?" "It's just, family stuff. I mean, specifically. The rental fee, the groceries, the gas for the boats, the cleaning deposit. Who writes those checks?" A look of discomfort crossed Sarah's face. "Mom, does it really matter? We're family. We all contribute in different ways." "Do we?" Sandra's voice remained calm, but something in her tone made both her children shift in their chairs. "James, when was the last time you contributed money to a family vacation?" James looked down at his plate. "Mom, you know I'm a teacher. I don't exactly have a lot of extra. I'm not criticizing your finances, sweetheart. I'm asking a factual question. When was the last time anyone besides me paid for a family vacation?" The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clink of Marcus setting down his coffee cup. He was looking at Sandra with something that might have been recognition, the expression of someone who was beginning to understand the real conversation happening beneath the surface. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "why are you asking this?" "Because," Sandra said, folding her napkin with precise movements, "your father just disinvited me from a family trip that I would be paying for to a lake house that I've been covering the costs for, with the explanation that there isn't room for everyone. And both of you think I should understand and be grateful for the break." The words hung in the air like morning frost, beautiful and sharp and impossible to ignore. Sarah's mouth opened and closed without sound. James stared at his mother as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "But Dad said," Sarah began, then stopped. "What did your father say exactly?" "He said it was a family expense, and that with Jennifer's kids coming, it made sense for you to disappear," Sandra suggested gently. "That's not... He didn't mean it like that." "How did he mean it then?" Sarah looked helplessly at her brother, but James was studying his hands with the focused attention of someone who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. Marcus cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Collins," he said. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but this sounds like a really difficult situation." Sandra smiled at him, the first genuine smile she'd felt all evening. "Thank you, Marcus. It is difficult, and please call me Sandra." "Sandra," he continued, "I'm probably overstepping, but if you're paying for the trip and you want to go, why should anyone else's comfort matter more than yours?" The question was so simple, so obvious, that Sandra felt something unlock in her chest. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought, though Marcus was hardly that. He was just someone who hadn't been trained to think that Sandra Collins was naturally disposable. That's not how family works," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Marcus asked mildly. "I mean, in my family, if someone is paying for something, they generally get a say in how it goes." "It's more complicated than that," Sarah said, but she was looking at her, mother with new uncertainty. "Is it?" Sandra asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems fairly straightforward. Your father excluded me from an event I would be funding without consulting me, and both of you think I should accept that gracefully because it's for the good of the family. I'm curious. Whose family are we talking about? Because it's apparently not mine." The words came out steady and calm, but Sandra could feel years of suppressed truth rising in her voice. She was 58 years old, and for the first time in decades, she was saying exactly what she meant without softening it, without apologizing, without making room for everyone else's comfort at the expense of her own clarity. "Mom," Sarah said weakly, "you're being..." "What?" Sandra's eyes met her daughter's. What am I being, Sarah? Difficult. The word fell between them like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples in all directions. Sandra sat back in her chair, and for a moment she just looked at her daughter. Really looked at her. Sarah was beautiful and smart and accomplished, a young woman who had been raised to believe that she could have anything she wanted as long as she worked hard and played fair. But somewhere along the way, Sarah had also learned that other people's wants mattered more than her mother's needs, that other people's comfort was more important than her mother's dignity. Difficult, Sandra repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose I am being difficult. How curious that I've managed to be so easy to work with for so many years. If Sandra's story resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family or underestimated by people who should know better, drop a comment below and share your experience. Your courage in sharing helps build our community of strong women supporting each other. The dinner ended awkwardly, with Sarah and James exchanging worried glances and Marcus offering to help with dishes in a tone that suggested he understood he'd witnessed something significant. After they left, Sandra found herself standing alone in her kitchen again, surrounded by the detritus of a meal that had tasted like everything she'd ever swallowed without protest. She didn't call Maria Wilson that night, though her fingers hovered over the phone several times. Maria was her oldest friend, the one person who had known Sandra since before marriage, and children had transformed her from a confident young woman into someone who specialized in making herself small. Maria would have listened, would have been appropriately outraged on Sandra's behalf, would have offered wine and validation and the kind of fierce loyalty that true friendship provided. But Sandra wasn't ready for wine and validation. She was ready for something else entirely, something that felt dangerous and necessary and long overdue. Instead of calling Maria, Sandra walked through her house slowly, really looking at it for the first time in years. The family photos, that lined the hallway documenting decades of holidays and birthdays and milestones. The furniture she'd chosen carefully over the years, pieces that would last and age gracefully and never draw attention to themselves. The built-in bookshelves filled with novels and biographies and cookbooks, evidence of a mind that had never stopped growing even when its owner had learned to hide. She ended up in what she still called Philip's office, though he'd moved out 3 years ago, and she'd gradually transformed it into her own workspace. The desk was antique cherry wood, a piece she'd inherited from her grandmother, along with so many other things. The chair was ergonomic and practical, chosen for long hours of work that no one in her family ever asked about. And in the corner, almost hidden behind a tall plant, stood a filing cabinet that held the remnants of her former life. Sandra had always been organized, but in the months following her divorce, she'd become almost obsessively so. Every important document had been filed, labeled, and cross-referenced. Every financial record had been preserved and cataloged. She'd told herself it was practical. A newly single woman needed to understand her financial position. But as she pulled out the thick folder labeled Personal Documents, Sandra realized it had been something else entirely. It had been preparation. She spread the papers across the desk surface like a detective laying out evidence. And for the first time in years, she really examined the life she'd built in shadow. The property deed for her house, purchased outright with money from her father's estate. The investment accounts she managed herself, grown quietly over decades of careful planning. The life insurance policy that made her children the beneficiaries of wealth they didn't know existed. And there, in a folder she hadn't opened in months, the documents that would change everything if her family ever bothered to look at them. The property deed for the lake house in New Hampshire, purchased 15 years ago when Philip's business was struggling and they'd needed a family retreat they could actually afford. The mortgage papers that showed the loan in her name alone, paid off early with money from her private accounts. the rental history that proved she'd been covering the annual costs for family trips that everyone assumed were community expenses. Sandra Collins, the quietly accommodating ex-wife who lived modestly on her settlement, owned the lake house, had always owned it, had been funding family trips to her own property for 15 years, while everyone, including her own children, assumed she was simply grateful to be included. She sat back in her chair and felt something that had been twisted tight in her chest for years finally begin to unwind. Not anger exactly, though there was some of that. Not hurt, though there was plenty of that too. What she felt was something far more dangerous to a life built on accommodation. She felt clarity. The next morning, Sandra did something she hadn't done in years. She canceled her volunteer shift at the community center and her part-time hours at the library, and instead drove to the office of Harold Brooks, the family lawyer who had been handling her legal affairs since before her marriage. Harold was a man in his 70s, distinguished in the way that suggested competence rather than pretension, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office reflected the same understated quality: good furniture that had aged well, books that had been read rather than merely displayed, the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate life's complications with dignity intact. "Sandra," he said as she settled into the familiar leather chair across from his desk, "it's good to see you. How are you managing?" It was the kind of polite inquiry that usually prompted an equally polite response. "Fine, thank you, keeping busy, can't complain." The social lubrication that kept conversation smooth and feeling safely buried. But Sandra looked at Harold's genuinely concerned expression and found herself telling the truth. "I'm not entirely sure," she said, "which is why I'm here." Harold set down his pen and gave her his complete attention. "What can I do for you?" "I want to review all my assets," Sandra said. "Everything. Properties, investments, insurance policies, trusts, all of it." Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is there a particular concern? Has someone suggested there's a problem with your financial management?" "No," Sandra said slowly. "The problem is that no one knows there's anything to manage." For the next 2 hours, Harold Brooks spread Sandra's financial life across his conference table with the methodical precision of someone who understood that numbers told stories and that Sandra's story was not what anyone would expect. The lake house in New Hampshire, purchased and maintained entirely from her personal accounts. 3 rental properties in different states, inherited from her father and managed so quietly that even Philip had never known they existed. Investment accounts that had grown steadily over decades of careful planning, funded by inheritances and her own earned income from jobs that everyone assumed were merely ways to keep busy. Sandra Collins, the woman who lived modestly on her divorce settlement, was worth just over $3 million. "Sandra," Harold said finally, looking at her over his glasses with something between admiration and concern, "you've been extraordinarily prudent with your finances, but I have to ask, does your family understand the scope of your assets?" Sandra thought about Philip's casual dismissal the night before, about Sarah and James's automatic assumption that she should be grateful for exclusion, about the years of being treated as someone whose contributions were expected, but whose preferences were irrelevant. "No," she said, quietly, "I don't believe they do." Harold was quiet for a long moment, and Sandra could see him choosing his words carefully. "In my experience," he said finally, "people treat us according to the information we give them about who we are. If we present ourselves as having limited resources, others tend to assume we have limited value in other ways as well." "Are you suggesting I've brought this on myself?" "Not at all," Harold said firmly. "I'm suggesting that you've been so generous and so private that you've allowed people to form opinions about your life that aren't based in reality. The question is, what do you want to do about that?" Sandra looked out Harold's office window at the spring afternoon, where people were walking by with the purposeful energy of those who knew where they belonged in the world. For 58 years, she had shaped herself around other people's needs, other people's assumptions, other people's comfort. She had been so good at disappearing herself that even she had sometimes forgotten she was there. "I want to stop being invisible," she said. Harold smiled, the expression of someone who had spent decades watching clients find their courage. "Then let's talk about what that might look like." Chapter 3. The first test of Sandra's newfound clarity came sooner than she expected. 3 days after her meeting with Harold Brooks, Philip called with what he clearly considered a reasonable request. "Sandra, I hope you don't mind, but I gave Jennifer your number. She wanted to coordinate with you about Sarah's bridal shower." Sandra, who was repotting herbs in her kitchen while the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, paused with her hands still deep in potting soil. "Coordinate about what, exactly?" "Well, you know, the usual. The venue, the catering, the decorations. Jennifer has some great ideas, but she thought you'd want to be involved since you're Sarah's mother." How generous of Jennifer, Sandra thought, to allow her to be involved in planning her own daughter's bridal shower. And what does Sarah think about this? "Oh, you know Sarah. She's swamped with work, and she trusts us to handle the details. She just wants everyone to get along and have a nice time." Sandra carefully set down the small lavender plant she'd been transplanting. In the old days, which was to say, any time before this week, she would have immediately agreed. She would have spent the next month coordinating with Jennifer, deferring to Jennifer's preferences, and probably paying for most of the event while Jennifer received credit for the planning. Sarah would have been happy because there was no conflict. Philip would have been satisfied that the women were working together. And Sandra would have disappeared herself once again in service of family harmony. "That's thoughtful of Jennifer," Sandra said carefully, "but I think I'd prefer to plan Sarah's bridal shower myself." The silence that followed was so complete that Sandra wondered if Philip had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the confused frustration of someone whose expectations had been disrupted without warning. "Sandra, that doesn't make sense. Jennifer's already started making plans. She's looked into venues. She's got ideas for themes. Why would you want to start over from scratch?" "Because she's my daughter," Sandra said simply. "But Jennifer's family now, too. She's trying to build relationships, and honestly, she's better at this kind of thing than you are." The words hit Sandra like a slap, but instead of the familiar sting of hurt feelings, she felt something else entirely. She felt the crystalline clarity of someone who has finally heard the truth spoken out loud. "Better at what kind of thing, Philip?" "You know, party planning, social stuff. Jennifer ran events for her marketing firm before she had kids. She knows how to put together something really special." Sandra looked around her kitchen with its carefully chosen details and evidence of decades of social stuff. The herb garden by the window that she'd planted and tended, the cookbooks filled with recipes she'd perfected for countless family gatherings, the china cabinet holding dishes she'd selected for their beauty and durability, used for hundreds of dinner parties and holiday meals and celebrations that had brought joy to everyone who attended them. "I see," she said. "And what would my role be in this arrangement?" "Well, you'd be involved, of course." Jennifer just thought, "Maybe you could handle some of the smaller details, or help with the setup. You're always so good at that kind of thing. You're always so good at that kind of thing. The invisible work, the behind-the-scenes labor, the setup and cleanup, and all the unglamorous tasks that made other people's celebrations possible." Sandra had been so good at that kind of thing for 30 years, so reliable and uncomplaining that everyone had forgotten there was a difference between willing participation and grateful subservience. "Philip," Sandra said, her voice steady and calm, I'm going to plan my daughter's bridal shower. If Jennifer wants to be involved, she's welcome to coordinate with me. Sandra, don't be unreasonable about this. Jennifer's trying to... I'm not being unreasonable. I'm being clear. Sarah is my daughter, and I'm going to handle her bridal shower. If that's a problem for Jennifer, I suggest she plan her own daughter's bridal shower when the time comes. Sandra hung up before Philip could respond and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet of her kitchen. Her hands were still dirty from repotting, and she could smell the earthy sweetness of fresh soil and new growth. Outside her window, the world continued its normal rhythm, but inside Sandra's chest, something fundamental had shifted. She had said no, not let me think about it, not maybe we can compromise, not I understand your position, but she had simply, clearly, definitively said no, and the world had not ended. The phone rang again almost immediately, and Sandra looked at the caller ID to see Sarah's name flashing on the screen. She let it ring 4 times before answering, using those moments to center herself in the new reality she was creating. "Hi, sweetheart. Mom, what's going on? Dad just called me, and he's really upset. He said you hung up on him." Sandra could hear the familiar note of worried peacemaking in her daughter's voice, the tone Sarah had used since childhood whenever conflict threatened the family equilibrium. It was the voice of someone who had learned that her mother's feelings were always negotiable in service of everyone else's comfort. "I ended a conversation that wasn't going anywhere productive," Sandra said calmly. "How are you doing, honey?" "Mom, that's not... what's this about the bridal shower? Jennifer was so excited to help plan it." "I'm sure she was, and she's welcome to help as long as she understands that I'm planning my daughter's bridal shower. But Mom, you don't have to do everything yourself. Jennifer has great connections, and she really wants to be involved. Can't you just work together?" There it was again, the automatic assumption that Sandra should accommodate, should compromise, should make room for everyone else's wants at the expense of her own preferences. Even her own daughter couldn't imagine a scenario where Sandra's desires might take precedence over someone else's feelings. "Sarah," Sandra said gently, "when was the last time you asked me what I wanted?" "What do you mean?" "I'm asking you now." "No, you're asking me to do what would make everyone else comfortable." "That's different." Sandra could hear Sarah's confused silence, and she felt a pang of sympathy for her daughter. Sarah had grown up in a world where her mother's compliance was as reliable as sunrise, where family harmony was maintained through Sandra's willingness to bend and accommodate and disappear when necessary. The idea that Sandra might have preferences that conflicted with other people's comfort was genuinely foreign to her. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening with you lately. First the lake house thing, now this. It's like you're trying to cause problems." "What if I am?" Sandra asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, and Sandra could almost hear her daughter's world view reorganizing itself around this impossible possibility. "What? What if I am trying to cause problems, Sarah? What if I'm tired of being the one who always accommodates, who always steps aside, who always makes everyone else's comfort more important than my own dignity? What if I've decided that some problems are worth causing?" "Mom, that's not... You're not like that." "No," Sandra agreed. "I haven't been like that. But maybe I should have been." The conversation ended with Sarah promising to think about everything, and Sandra promising to be reasonable, though they both suspected they meant different things by those promises. After hanging up, Sandra walked through her quiet house and tried to understand the strange mixture of grief and relief that was settling in her chest. For 30 years, she had been the family's shock absorber, the one who smoothed over conflicts and managed emotions and made sure everyone else could be comfortable being themselves. She had been so good at it, so consistent and reliable, that her family had forgotten. She was a person with her own needs and wants and boundaries. In their eyes, she had become a function rather than a human being, useful, dependable, and ultimately disposable when more appealing options presented themselves. But functions didn't own lake houses. Functions didn't have investment portfolios or property deeds or the quiet power that came from decades of careful planning. Functions didn't hire lawyers or change locks or make decisions that prioritized their own dignity over other people's convenience. Sandra Collins was not a function. She was a woman who owned her own life, and it was time her family learned the difference. That evening, as Sandra was preparing a simple dinner for one, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she could see Maria Wilson standing on her front porch with a bottle of wine and the expression of someone who had heard rumors and wanted facts. Maria had been Sandra's friend since college, back when Sandra was a confident young woman majoring in business and planning to take over her father's real estate investments. Maria had watched Sandra fall in love with Philip, had been maid of honor at their wedding, had held Sandra's hand through difficult pregnancies, and celebrated with her when the babies were healthy and beautiful. Maria had also been there during the divorce, offering practical support and emotional strength when Sandra's world had reorganized itself around single motherhood and starting over. What Maria had never done was pretend that Sandra's marriage had been easy, or that Philip's treatment of her had been acceptable, or that Sandra's tendency to disappear herself in service of family peace was healthy for anyone involved. "I brought wine," Maria announced as Sandra opened the door, "and I have questions." Sandra smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in days. "Come in, I have answers." They settled in Sandra's living room, a space that perfectly reflected its owner's understated elegance. The furniture was comfortable but refined, chosen for both beauty and durability. The colors were soft neutrals punctuated with touches of deep blue and warm gold, and every surface held evidence of a life well lived. Books that had been read, photographs that captured genuine joy, small objects that held memories rather than mere decoration. Maria poured wine into glasses Sandra had bought for herself after the divorce, good crystal that caught the lamplight and felt substantial in the hand and settled back into the familiar rhythm of friendship. "Sarah called me," Maria said without preamble. "She's worried about you. She says you're acting strange, causing problems, being unreasonable." Maria took a sip of wine and regarded Sandra with the direct gaze of someone who had earned the right to honest conversations. "She asked me to talk to you about getting back to normal." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that maybe normal wasn't working for you anymore." Maria leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. "Sandra, what's going on? And don't give me the polite version, give me the truth." So Sandra did. She told Maria about Philip's casual dismissal, about the lake house exclusion, about the assumption that she should fund her own erasure. She told her about the meeting with Harold Brooks, about the numbers that had surprised even her, about the quiet wealth she'd accumulated while everyone assumed she was struggling on her divorce settlement. Most importantly, she told Maria about the moment of clarity that had come while standing in her kitchen, looking at her garden, and realizing that she had been praised for 30 years for making herself disappear. $3 million, Maria repeated when Sandra finished. "You're worth $3 million, and your family thinks you should be grateful for their scraps." "It's not about the money." "The hell it isn't," Maria interrupted, but her voice was warm with affection rather than anger. "It's absolutely about the money, Sandra. Because the money represents choices. It represents power. It represents the ability to say no when people treat you badly. And your family has been treating you badly for years because they thought you didn't have any other options." Sandra sipped her wine and considered this. "Do you think I've been wrong? Keeping quiet about my situation? I think you've been protecting people who didn't deserve protection," Maria said bluntly. And I think you've been so busy taking care of everyone else that you forgot you deserve to be taken care of too." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two women in their late 50s who had learned enough about life to recognize both its cruelties and its possibilities. Outside, the spring evening was settling into dusk, and Sandra's house felt like exactly what it was: a sanctuary she had created for herself, a space where she could be entirely and authentically who she was. "So what are you going to do?" Maria asked finally. Sandra thought about the lake house sitting empty in New Hampshire, about the family vacation that was being planned without her input or presence, about the assumption that she would fund what she was not welcome to enjoy. "I'm going to stop being invisible," she said. Maria smiled. "It's about time." Chapter 4. The next few weeks passed with the strange tension of a storm building on the horizon. Sandra continued her quiet life, tending her garden, working her shifts at the library, maintaining the careful routines that had defined her days for years. But underneath the familiar rhythms, something fundamental had changed. She no longer moved through the world like water, finding the path of least resistance. Instead, she began to occupy space with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. The first sign that her family had noticed the shift came during what should have been a routine phone call from James. Her son called every Sunday evening, a habit they'd established after the divorce to ensure regular contact. These conversations usually followed a predictable pattern. James would update her on his teaching, his girlfriend Rachel, his weekend activities. Sandra would ask interested questions, offer encouragement, and provide the kind of warm maternal presence that made James feel connected without requiring him to examine their relationship too closely. But this Sunday, James had a different agenda. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation at Sarah's birthday dinner," he said after they'd covered the usual topics, about the lake house and the money stuff. Sandra set down the book she'd been reading and gave him her full attention. "What about it?" "Well, I was wondering... Sarah and I have been talking and we're kind of confused about some things." "What kind of things?" James cleared his throat, and Sandra could hear the discomfort in the sound. "Like, if you own the lake house, why didn't you ever tell us? And if you're paying for all these family trips, why do you let Dad act like he's in charge of everything?" The questions hung between them, innocent in their phrasing but loaded with implications. Why didn't you tell us you had power? Why did you let us treat you like you didn't matter? Why did you allow us to participate in your own erasure? "James," Sandra said carefully, "why do you think I kept quiet about my financial situation?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking. Think about it, sweetheart. When have any of you ever asked about my finances? When has anyone in this family expressed interest in whether I was comfortable, whether I had enough, whether I needed anything?" The silence that followed was longer than comfortable, and Sandra could almost hear her son processing this uncomfortable truth. After the divorce, Dad said you were set up okay. He said the settlement was fair. And you never wondered what okay meant? You never asked if I was struggling or worried or making sacrifices to maintain the lifestyle you all expected. "Mom, that's not fair. We would have helped if you'd said you needed anything." "Would you have?" Sandra asked gently. "Or would you have expected me to handle it quietly the way I've always handled everything else?" Another pause. "I don't understand what you're getting at." "I'm getting at the fact that for 30 years, I've been the one who takes care of things, who solves problems, who makes sure everyone else is comfortable and happy. And all of you have gotten so used to that arrangement that you've forgotten I'm a person who might have needs and wants of my own. That's not true, Mom. We care about you. I know you love me, James. But caring about someone and considering their feelings are different things. When was the last time any of you made a family decision based on what I might want? The question settled between them like dust after a building collapse, and Sandra could hear her son struggling with the answer because there wasn't a good one. Family decisions were made by Philip, implemented by Jennifer, and accommodated by Sandra. Her preferences were noted when they aligned with everyone else's comfort and ignored when they didn't. "The lake house thing," James said finally, his voice small. "We should have asked you how you felt about it." "Yes," Sandra agreed. "You should have." "And the bridal shower thing with Jennifer." "Yes. Mom, I'm sorry. I think we've all gotten so used to you being, I don't know, flexible about stuff that we stopped thinking about whether it was fair." Sandra felt a mix of sadness and hope at her son's words. Sadness because it had taken this long for any of her children to see the pattern. Hope because he was seeing it at all. "James, I love this family. I have spent decades putting your happiness and your father's comfort ahead of my own, and I don't regret that entirely. But I'm 58 years old, and I'm tired of being treated like my feelings don't matter." "They do matter, Mom. Of course they matter." "Then prove it," Sandra said quietly. "What do you mean?" "The lake house trip is next weekend. Your father excluded me because there isn't room for everyone, but he's planning to use my property and expects me to fund the expenses. If my feelings matter, what are you going to do about that?" The silence stretched so long that Sandra wondered if the connection had been lost. When James finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had just been handed a test he wasn't sure he could pass. "I don't know, Mom." "It's complicated." "No," Sandra said gently. "It's really not. Either my feelings matter or they don't. Either I deserve to be treated with respect in my own family, or I don't. Either you're willing to stand up for what's right, or you're not. But if I make a big deal about this, it'll cause problems with Dad and Jennifer. And Sarah's already stressed about her wedding planning, and my feelings are less important than everyone else's comfort." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Sandra said. "You just explained why it's more important to keep everyone else happy than it is to treat me fairly." After the call ended, Sandra sat in her quiet living room and felt the full weight of 30 years of family dynamics pressing against her chest. Her children loved her. She had no doubt about that. But they loved her the way one loves a reliable appliance, with gratitude for consistent service and frustration when it stops working as expected. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, Sandra found it oddly liberating. For the first time in decades, she could see the family structure clearly without the soft focus of her own wishful thinking. She could see the roles everyone played, the expectations that governed their interactions, and her own complicity in maintaining a system that served everyone except herself. And now she could choose whether to continue participating in that system. 2 days later, Philip called with what he clearly expected to be the final word on lake house logistics. "Sandra, I wanted to touch base about the weekend expenses. Jennifer's worked out a budget for groceries and activities, and we figure your share comes to about $1,500. Sandra, who was deadheading roses in her garden while a warm afternoon sun painted everything in gold, paused with her pruning shears halfway to a spent bloom. "My share?" she asked. "Well, your portion of the family expenses. Even though you're not coming, we thought you'd want to contribute since Sarah and James will be there representing your side of the family." The casual assumption in Philip's voice that she would pay for her own exclusion, that she would fund a family vacation she wasn't welcome to attend, was so breathtaking in its audacity that Sandra had to admire it. It took a special kind of entitlement to exclude someone from an event and then bill them for the privilege. "Philip," Sandra said, her voice steady despite the anger beginning to simmer in her chest, "where exactly do you think this money is coming from?" "What do you mean?" "Your account, obviously. The same place it always comes from." "And what account is that?" There was a pause, and Sandra could hear the faint confusion in Philip's voice. I don't know, Sandra. Whatever account you use for this stuff. Does it matter? It matters to me. I'm curious which of my accounts you think should fund your family vacation. Our family vacation, Sandra. Just because you're not physically there doesn't mean... Actually, Philip, it does mean exactly that, and I'm curious about something else. Where do you think the money for previous lake house trips has come from? The silence that followed was different from the usual pauses in their conversations. This was the silence of someone whose assumptions were being challenged in a way that made him fundamentally uncomfortable. I don't understand what you're asking, Philip said finally. I'm asking who has been paying for 15 years of family vacations to the lake house. We have. The family. We all contribute. Do we? Because I can't remember the last time you wrote a check for a family vacation. Or James. Or Sarah, for that matter. Sandra, what's gotten into you lately? You're acting like money is the only thing that matters. Money isn't the only thing that matters, Philip. But respect matters. And being treated like a human being instead of an ATM matters. And not being excluded from events that I'm expected to fund matters quite a bit. Look, if this is about the space issue, maybe we can work something out. This isn't about space, Sandra interrupted, and her voice carried a steel edge that made Philip go quiet. This is about the fact that you called me up and told me I wasn't invited to a family trip, then called back to bill me for it. And the truly remarkable thing is that you seem to think this is reasonable. I'm trying to include you financially since you can't be there physically. Philip, Sandra said, and something in her tone made him stop talking entirely. Who owns the lake house? The question hung in the afternoon air like smoke, visible and impossible to ignore. Sandra could hear birds singing in her garden, could smell the sweet fragrance of the roses she'd been tending, could feel the solid reality of her own property beneath her feet, and she could hear, in the sudden quality of Philip's silence, the exact moment when he began to understand that this conversation was not going the way he had expected. What do you mean? He asked finally. I mean exactly what I asked. Who owns the lake house? It's a family property. That's not what I asked. I asked who owns it, whose name is on the deed. The silence stretched longer this time, and Sandra could almost hear the gears turning in Philip's mind as he tried to work through a question he had apparently never bothered to consider. Sandra, why are you asking this? Because you're billing me $1,500 for the use of a property, and I'm curious about the legal basis for that charge. Sandra, you're being ridiculous. It's a family property. We all use it. We all contribute. Philip, Sandra said, her voice cutting through his bluster with quiet authority. The lake house is in my name. I own it. I bought it 15 years ago when your business was struggling and we needed a place the family could afford to vacation. I've been paying the property taxes, the maintenance, the insurance, and all the expenses for family trips ever since. You have been taking family vacations to my house, funded by my money, while treating me like a guest who should be grateful to be included. The silence that followed was so complete that Sandra wondered if Philip had dropped the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strange, as if he were speaking from a great distance. I don't understand. The lake house has always been mine, Sandra finished gently. It has always been mine. And now you want to exclude me from my own property and charge me for the privilege. Sandra, I had no idea. Yes, you did, she said quietly. You've known for 15 years that the expenses came from my accounts. You've known that I handled all the arrangements, all the payments, all the logistics. You just never bothered to think about what that meant because it was convenient not to know. Philip's voice, when it came, sounded smaller than she'd heard it in years. Sandra, if I had understood, if you had understood what? You would have treated me differently? You would have consulted me before making decisions about my own property? You would have considered my feelings before excluding me from a family tradition I've been funding for over a decade. Have you ever discovered that your own kindness was being used against you? That the people you loved most had mistaken your generosity for weakness? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes we need to hear we're not alone in these painful realizations. I never meant for you to feel excluded. Philip, Sandra said, and her voice carried the finality of someone who had finally reached the end of her patience. I need you to understand something very clearly. The lake house is my property. The family vacations have been funded by me, and I am done pretending otherwise for the sake of everyone else's comfort. What does that mean? Sandra looked around her garden, at the roses she had planted and tended, at the life she had built with her own hands and her own careful planning. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, who would have apologized for causing confusion and probably written Philip a check to avoid further conflict. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she remembered fondly but could no longer pretend to be. It means, Sandra said, that if you want to take a family vacation to the lake house, you need to ask the owner for permission. And you need to treat the owner with the respect she deserves. She hung up before Philip could respond and stood for a moment in the golden afternoon light, feeling something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called. She felt powerful. Chapter 5. The next 48 hours passed in a flurry of phone calls that Sandra chose not to answer and voicemails she deleted without listening to. She could imagine their content easily enough. Philip's confusion and demands for clarification, Sarah's worried entreaties to work things out, James's uncomfortable attempts to mediate. The family crisis management system that had always depended on Sandra's willingness to absorb everyone else's emotions and make their problems disappear. But Sandra was no longer available for crisis management. Instead, she spent Thursday afternoon at Harold Brooks' office, signing papers and discussing logistics with the calm efficiency of someone who had finally decided to live in reality instead of wishful thinking. Harold, to his credit, asked no unnecessary questions and offered no judgments. He simply helped her put legal weight behind the personal boundaries she'd decided to establish. Friday morning, Sandra loaded her Honda with everything she would need for a peaceful Memorial Day weekend. Groceries for simple, nourishing meals, books she'd been meaning to read, art supplies for the watercolor painting she'd always told herself she'd try someday. She drove the familiar 3 hours to Lake Winnisquam, windows down and music playing, feeling lighter than she had in years. The lake house sat exactly as she'd left it last fall, a modest but beautifully maintained cottage with wide windows that captured the morning light and a deck that overlooked water so clear you could see the bottom 20 feet from shore. Sandra had fallen in love with the property the moment she'd seen it, not because it was grand or impressive, but because it felt like peace, made tangible. Like the kind of place where a person could remember who they really were underneath all the roles they played for other people. She spent Friday evening on the deck with a glass of wine and her watercolors, painting the sunset over water that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. The colors shifted and changed as she worked, and Sandra found herself thinking about transformation, about how sometimes the most beautiful changes happen slowly, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly everything was different. Saturday morning, she was making coffee in the sunny kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming in the gravel driveway. Sandra walked to the front window and looked out at a scene that might have been funny if it weren't so perfectly illustrative of everything that had been wrong with her family dynamics for decades. Philip's silver SUV sat in her driveway, engine still ticking as it cooled, packed with enough luggage and equipment for a small army. Jennifer stood beside the passenger door with the bewildered expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had just collided with an unexpected obstacle. Tyler and Madison, Jennifer's teenage children, clustered near the back of the vehicle with the resigned patience of kids who had learned that adult drama was best weathered with minimal engagement. And there, looking more confused than Sandra had ever seen him, was Philip Thornfield, holding a set of keys that would no longer work in the locks he was approaching with such confident familiarity. Sandra watched from her window as Philip tried his key in the front door lock, jiggled it when it didn't work, tried again with the careful determination of someone who couldn't quite accept that his expectations were not going to be met. When the key continued to fail him, he stepped back and stared at the door as if it had personally betrayed him. Jennifer said something Sandra couldn't hear through the window, and Philip responded with the kind of animated gestures that suggested confusion, moving rapidly toward anger. Tyler and Madison exchanged a look that suggested they were already planning their escape routes from whatever family drama was about to unfold. Sandra finished making her coffee, added cream and honey the way she liked it, and walked to the front door. She stood there for a moment, feeling the solid wood beneath her hand, the brass handle that responded to her touch, the reality of standing in her own home, on her own property, with her own power in her own hands. Then she opened the door. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. The effect of her voice was immediate and electric. Philip spun around as if he'd been shocked, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and the beginning edges of something that might have been panic. Jennifer's carefully composed features rearranged themselves around the realization that whatever she had been expecting, it wasn't this. The teenagers perked up with the interested attention of young people who sensed that the adult drama might actually be entertaining this time. "Sandra," Philip said, and her name came out like a question he didn't know how to ask. "What are you doing here?" Sandra sipped her coffee and regarded her ex-husband with the patient expression of someone who was exactly where she belonged. "I'm having coffee in my house." "What are you doing here? Your house?" Jennifer stepped forward, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, manicured hands gesturing toward the cottage as if claiming ownership through sheer force of gesture. "Philip, what is she talking about?" Philip opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sandra had never seen him speechless before, and she found it oddly fascinating. This was a man who had spent decades speaking with unshakable certainty about topics he'd never bothered to understand, who had made decisions based on assumptions he'd never thought to verify. Sandra, we need to talk about this." "Do we?" Sandra asked mildly. "I thought we already talked." "I thought I was very clear about the situation." "The situation," Philip repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. "The situation where you excluded me from a family vacation to my own property and then tried to bill me for the expenses." Jennifer's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock that drained color from her cheeks. "Philip, you said this was a family property." "It is a family property." Philip's voice carried the desperation of someone whose worldview was crumbling in real time. "Sandra, you can't just... This is ridiculous. We've been coming here for years." "Yes," Sandra agreed. "You've been coming to my house for years. As my guests, using my property and my resources while treating me like I should be grateful for the privilege." She stepped out onto the front deck, closing the door behind her with the quiet click of finality. The morning sun was warm on her face, and she could smell the pine trees that grew thick around the property, could hear the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore. It was peaceful here, the kind of peace that came from being exactly where you belonged. "Sandra," Philip said, and his voice had taken on the coaxing tone he'd always used when he wanted something from her. "Let's be reasonable about this. The kids are expecting a family weekend." "What kids?" Sandra interrupted gently. Philip gestured toward Jennifer's teenagers, who were watching this exchange with the fascinated attention of spectators at an unexpectedly interesting sporting event. "Tyler and Madison," Philip said. "They've been looking forward to this." "Tyler and Madison are Jennifer's children," Sandra observed. "Not mine, not yours. They're welcome to look forward to whatever they like, but that doesn't create an obligation for me to provide it. But Sarah and James are coming." "Are they?" Sandra asked. "Because I haven't heard from either of them since our last conversation. I was under the impression they were fine with the arrangement where I'm excluded from family activities." Philip's face flushed with the kind of anger that came from being caught in the uncomfortable space between his assumptions and reality. "Sandra, this is petty. This is beneath you." "Is it?" Sandra asked, and her voice remained perfectly calm. "Philip, you called me up and told me I wasn't welcome at a family gathering. You told me there wasn't room for me. You then tried to charge me money for the privilege of being excluded. And when I pointed out that you were excluding me from my own property, you're calling me petty for declining to fund my own humiliation." Jennifer stepped closer to Philip, and Sandra could see her trying to process this information, trying to reconcile the confident narrative Philip had provided with the uncomfortable reality they were now facing. "I don't understand," Jennifer said. "Philip, you told me Sandra couldn't afford to contribute much to family activities anymore. You said she was struggling financially after the divorce." Sandra felt something twist in her chest. Not hurt exactly, but a kind of sad recognition. Philip hadn't just excluded her. He had rewritten her story entirely, casting her as a woman who should be grateful for charity rather than someone who had been providing it all along. "I'm not struggling financially," Sandra said quietly. "I never was." Philip's face went through several color changes, and Sandra could see him trying to figure out how to manage this conversation, how to regain control of a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his ability to direct. "Sandra, if we could just discuss this privately." "No," Sandra said, and the word carried the finality of someone who had spent decades accommodating and was done. "Philip, you made this a public family matter when you excluded me and tried to bill me. We'll discuss it publicly." She looked at Jennifer, who was staring at Philip with the dawning realization that she had been operating with incomplete information. "Jennifer, I don't know what Philip told you about our family finances, but I've been the primary funder of family activities for 15 years. The lake house is mine. I bought it, I pay the taxes and maintenance, and I've covered the expenses for every family vacation we've taken here." "That can't be right," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's easily verified," Sandra said gently. "Harold Brooks, my lawyer, has all the documentation if you'd like to see it." The sound of another car pulling into the gravel driveway drew everyone's attention. Sandra looked up to see James's modest sedan, followed by Sarah's BMW, both vehicles packed with the kind of luggage that suggested their occupants had planned to stay for the weekend. Sandra watched as her children climbed out of their cars as they took in the scene before them. Philip and Jennifer standing by their fully packed SUV like displaced persons. Sandra standing calmly on the deck of what they had always assumed was a family property, the strange tension in the air that suggested something fundamental had shifted. "Mom?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying the careful uncertainty of someone who sensed she had walked into a situation she didn't understand. "What's going on?" "Good morning, sweetheart," Sandra said, and her voice was warm with genuine affection. "I'm having my coffee and enjoying the morning. How was your drive?" James looked between his parents with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Dad called yesterday and said there were some complications with the weekend plans, but he wasn't very clear about what was happening. "I'll bet he wasn't," Sandra said mildly. "Sandra," Philip said, and his voice carried a warning that no one who knew him would have missed. "I think we should discuss this as a family." "We are discussing it as a family," Sandra replied. Unless you're suggesting that I'm not part of this family. The question hung in the morning air like mist rising from the lake, beautiful and impossible to ignore. Sarah and James exchanged a look that suggested they were beginning to understand that whatever was happening, it was bigger than weekend logistics. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "Dad said there was some confusion about the lake house arrangements." "There was no confusion on my part," Sandra said. "Your father excluded me from a family vacation to my own property, then tried to charge me for the expenses. When I clarified that I own the lake house and have been funding these trips for 15 years, he seemed surprised." The silence that followed was so complete that Sandra could hear the water lapping against the dock, could hear birds calling from the pine trees that surrounded the property she had chosen and purchased and maintained with her own careful planning. Sarah's mouth opened and closed without sound. James stared at his mother as if she had just revealed that she was someone else entirely. "You own the lake house?" James asked finally. "I've always owned the lake house," Sandra confirmed. "I bought it 15 years ago when your father's business was struggling, and we needed a place we could afford for family vacations. I've been paying all the expenses ever since. But Dad always handled the arrangements." "No," Sandra said gently. "I handled the arrangements. I made the reservations, paid the bills, organized the activities, and prepared all the food. Your father announced the dates." Sarah looked at Philip with something that might have been accusation. "Dad, is this true?" Philip's face went through several expressions before settling on the kind of defensive anger that Sandra recognized from their marriage. The look of a man who had been caught in assumptions he couldn't defend. "It's more complicated than your mother is making it sound," he said. "The lake house has always been a family resource. Just because the paperwork is in Sandra's name doesn't mean—" "It means exactly that," Sandra interrupted, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally decided to speak plainly. "Philip, you've been taking your family to my house, eating food I purchased, using amenities I maintain, and treating me like a guest who should be grateful for the privilege. And when you decided there wasn't room for everyone, you excluded the owner and tried to bill her for the expenses." Jennifer had gone very quiet, and Sandra could see her processing this information, trying to reconcile it with whatever version of events Philip had provided. "Philip," Jennifer said slowly, "you told me Sandra was having trouble making ends meet. You said she needed help with expenses." Sandra felt a flash of something that wasn't quite anger, but was definitely related to it. Philip hadn't just excluded her. He had rewritten her entire identity, casting her as a woman who needed financial assistance rather than someone who had been providing it. "I've never needed financial assistance," Sandra said clearly. "I've been providing it." Sarah sank down onto the porch steps, as if her legs would no longer support her. "Mom, why didn't you tell us? All these years, why didn't you say anything?" It was the question Sandra had been expecting, and she had thought carefully about how to answer it, because the truth was complicated and painful and involved examining patterns that none of them really wanted to look at. "Sarah, when have any of you ever asked about my financial situation? When has anyone in this family shown interest in whether I was comfortable or worried or making sacrifices? We would have helped." "Would you have?" Sandra asked. "Or would you have expected me to handle it quietly, the way I've always handled everything else?" The question settled over the family like morning fog, heavy and impossible to ignore. Sarah looked at James, who was staring at the ground. Philip's jaw was tight with the kind of anger that came from being forced to examine uncomfortable truths. Jennifer was very still, as if she were trying to make herself invisible while everything she thought she knew reorganized itself around her. "I think," Sandra said into the silence, "that all of you have gotten so used To my taking care of things that you stopped thinking about whether I wanted to, or whether it was fair, or whether I deserved to be treated with the same consideration you'd give anyone else. That's not true, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Sandra asked gently. Sarah, when you were planning your wedding, who did you ask to step aside so Jennifer could take over? When the lake house wasn't big enough for everyone, who got excluded? When family decisions need to be made, who gets consulted last, if at all? Each question hit like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of recognition across her children's faces. Sandra could see the moment when they began to understand the pattern, when they started to see their family dynamics through her eyes instead of their own comfortable assumptions. Mom, James said quietly, I'm sorry. I should have seen. Yes, Sandra agreed. You should have. Philip stepped forward, his face flushed with the kind of anger that came from losing control of a situation he had expected to manage. Sandra, this is enough. You're making everyone uncomfortable, and you're confusing the kids. Can we please discuss this like adults? No, Sandra said, and the word came out with the calm finality of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their patience. Philip, I have spent 30 years discussing things like an adult while you made decisions like a child. I have accommodated and compromised and disappeared myself for the comfort of everyone in this family, and I am done. She walked down the porch steps, past her children and her ex-husband and his wife, to stand in the gravel driveway of her own property. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting everything in the golden light that made Lake Winnisquam look like something from a postcard. This is my house, Sandra said, her voice carrying across the morning air with perfect clarity. I bought it, I maintain it, and I decide who is welcome here. For 15 years, I have welcomed all of you as my guests, even when that generosity was taken for granted, and my hospitality was treated as an obligation rather than a gift. She looked at each of them in turn. Sarah with her stricken expression, James with his uncomfortable shame, Philip with his defensive anger, Jennifer with her dawning understanding of how badly she had misjudged the situation. You are welcome to stay, Sandra said, on one condition. You treat me with the respect I deserve as the owner of this property, and as a person whose feelings matter as much as anyone else's. You acknowledge that I have been extraordinarily generous, and you stop treating that generosity as if it were owed to you. And if we don't? Philip asked, his voice tight with challenge. Sandra smiled, and it was the expression of someone who finally understood her own power. Then you can find somewhere else to spend your weekend. There are several nice hotels in the area. The silence that followed was broken by Sarah's quiet voice. Mom, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I know you didn't, sweetheart. But that's the problem, isn't it? None of you bothered to know. Sarah stood up from the porch steps and walked toward her mother with the careful movement of someone approaching a wounded animal. Can we start over? Can I try to do better? Sandra looked at her daughter. Beautiful, accomplished Sarah, who had inherited her father's confidence, but might still have time to develop her mother's empathy, and felt her heart crack open with the kind of love that included accountability. I hope so, Sandra said, but it's going to require you to think about someone other than yourself. It's going to require you to consider my feelings even when they're inconvenient. It's going to require you to see me as a person who matters, not just a mother who gives. Sarah nodded, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. I can do that. I want to do that. James stepped forward tentatively. Mom, I want to try too. I've been a coward about standing up for you, and I'm sorry. Sandra nodded, accepting his apology while holding space for the hurt it couldn't entirely erase. Thank you, James. I hope you mean that. Philip, however, remained standing by his SUV with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the stubborn line Sandra remembered from every major conflict of their marriage. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Sandra, you're acting like we're strangers instead of family. Families work together. They don't keep score." Sandra looked at the man she had been married to for 25 years, the father of her children, and felt something that was almost like pity. Philip genuinely couldn't see what he had done wrong because he had never bothered to consider that Sandra's perspective might be as valid as his own. "Philip," she said gently, "families do work together, but working together means everyone contributes and everyone's needs matter. It doesn't mean one person gives while everyone else takes." "I've contributed." "How?" The question came out quietly, but it cut through Philip's bluster like a knife through silk. "How exactly have you contributed to these family vacations, Philip? What have you given besides your presence and your demands?" Philip's mouth opened and closed, and Sandra could see him searching for an answer that wouldn't make him look as selfish as they both knew he had been. I organized. I planned. I shopped. I cooked. I cleaned. I paid. You announced dates and showed up." Jennifer had been very quiet during this exchange, but now she stepped forward with the careful demeanor of someone who had realized she needed to recalibrate her understanding of the situation. "Sandra," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology. Philip led me to believe that that the situation was different than it is." Sandra looked at Jennifer. Perfectly groomed, confidently beautiful Jennifer, who had walked into a family dynamic she didn't understand and had made assumptions that served her own interests and felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness but might become it. "Thank you," Sandra said. "I appreciate that. Would it be possible for us to stay? I understand if you'd prefer that we didn't, but the kids were looking forward to this and—" Jennifer's voice trailed off as she realized she was asking for generosity from someone she had inadvertently helped to wound. Sandra studied Jennifer's face and saw genuine remorse there, along with the uncomfortable recognition of someone who had been forced to examine her own behavior and found it wanting. "You're welcome to stay," Sandra said finally, "all of you. But we're going to do things differently this time." "What does that mean?" Philip asked, and his voice still carried the edge of someone who didn't like having his authority questioned. "It means," Sandra said, moving toward the house with the confidence of someone who was finally home in her own life, "that you're guests in my house. You'll follow my rules, respect my property, and treat me with the courtesy you'd show any other host. And if that's too difficult for you, Philip, you're welcome to check into the Holiday Inn in town." She walked up the porch steps and opened the door to her lake house, her property, her sanctuary that she had shared so generously for so long that everyone had forgotten it was hers to share. "The choice is yours," she said, and disappeared inside, leaving her family to work out for themselves what kind of weekend they wanted to have. Through the kitchen window, Sandra watched as her children and Philip and Jennifer stood in uncertain clusters in her driveway, having hushed conversations and casting glances toward the house. She could see the moment when Sarah made her decision, gathering her luggage and walking toward the porch with the determined step of someone who had decided to try harder. James followed a moment later, his shoulders set with the posture of someone who is ready to do uncomfortable work. Jennifer hesitated, then began unloading her suitcase with the careful movements of someone who understood she was accepting an invitation that came with conditions. Tyler and Madison, who had watched this entire exchange with the fascinated attention of teenagers, discovering that adult relationships were far more complicated than they appeared, followed their mother with the resignation of people who had learned to adapt to changing circumstances. Philip stood alone by his SUV for a long time, staring at the house as if he could will it back into being the uncomplicated family resource he had always assumed it was. Sandra watched him wrestle with his pride, with his assumptions, with the uncomfortable reality that he was no longer the unquestioned authority in this particular situation. Finally, slowly, he began to unload his bags. 6 months later, Sandra would stand in this same kitchen on a crisp October morning, preparing coffee and watching the lake turn silver in the early light. She would think about the woman she had been the previous spring, the woman who had moved through the world like water, who had shaped herself around everyone else's needs, who had been praised for 30 years for making herself disappear. That woman felt like someone she had known and loved and finally learned to outgrow. The lake house had become something different now, still a place for family gatherings, but gatherings where Sandra's preferences mattered as much as anyone else's, where her contributions were acknowledged and appreciated rather than assumed and taken for granted, where she was treated as the generous host she had always been, instead of the grateful guest she had never wanted to be. Her relationship with Sarah was deeper now, built on mutual respect instead of Sarah's assumptions and Sandra's accommodation. James had learned to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable, and their conversations had the honest foundation that comes from seeing each other clearly. Philip still struggled sometimes with the new dynamic, but he was learning, slowly and perfectly, to consider Sandra's feelings before making pronouncements about family activities. Jennifer had become, surprisingly, something like a friend, bonded by their shared experience of discovering that the stories they'd been told about Sandra weren't true. But the most important change was in Sandra herself. She no longer moved through the world apologizing for taking up space. She no longer shaped herself around other people's comfort at the expense of her own dignity. She had learned the difference between generosity and self-erasure, between love and enabling, between keeping peace and keeping quiet. She had learned, at 58, that it was never too late to stop being invisible in your own life. If Sandra's journey inspired you, subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories and ring that bell, because every woman deserves to know she's not alone in reclaiming her power. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you discovered your family was taking advantage of your generosity? Have you ever had to choose between peace and self-respect? Share this story with any woman who needs to remember her own worth. Sometimes we all need reminding that quiet strength is still strength, and that the most loving thing we can do is stop enabling disrespectful behavior. Standing at her kitchen window, Sandra Collins smiled as the morning sun painted her lake in shades of gold and silver. She was finally at home in her own life, and it was the most beautiful view she had ever seen.